There is a kind of man the world learns to step around, not because he asks for space, he never asks for anything, but because the air around him changes when he enters a room, colder, thinner, like the atmosphere before a storm that has already decided where it will strike. Alaric Ravenshade is that kind of man, and on the night he takes a wife he does not want, in a hall full of people who fear him, you will see something no one in this kingdom has ever witnessed. The Iron Duke standing completely still while everything inside him moves. Stay until the end. What breaks a man like this is not a sword. It never is. The Iron Duke and the Political Bride. Part 1. The Weight of a Name. The candles in the great hall of Whitmore House had been burning for 6 hours. Celia counted them once, early in the evening, when counting still felt like something she could control. 47 candles along the eastern wall, 32 along the west, and a chandelier overhead so heavy with wax and iron that she'd spent her childhood half convinced it would fall and solve whatever problem currently needed solving. Tonight the problem wore a black coat and stood near the fireplace with the particular stillness of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. She watched him from across the room the way you watched a fire through glass. Safe distance. The illusion of safety. Duke Alaric Ravenshade had not moved in 20 minutes. He held a glass of wine he hadn't touched. He spoke when spoken to, brief, courteous, precise, and the men who approached him retreated looking slightly diminished, as if conversation with him had subtracted something they couldn't name. He was not unkind. That was the unsettling part. He was simply absolute. Every word he offered carried the weight of finality, as though the question had already been decided before it was asked, and the asking was merely a formality he tolerated out of old habit. He was 38 years old. He looked like a man who had aged into himself rather than away from himself. No softening around the jaw, no retreat behind comfort or excess. His face was angular and unhurried, the kind of face that didn't change expression so much as modulate it, like a musician shifting keys. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples. His eyes, from across the room, were the color of a winter river, gray and deep and moving in ways you couldn't see from the shore. Celia was 20. She had known this was coming for 3 months. Her father had told her over breakfast, which she'd always thought was a strange choice of setting. The morning light coming through the east windows, the smell of bread and butter, her youngest sister arguing about whether the jam was raspberry or strawberry, and her father saying quietly, but without apology, that he had arranged for her to marry Alaric Ravenshade of the Northern Duchy, and that the wedding would be held before the winter season closed the mountain passes. He'd said it the way he said everything difficult, with the tone of a man who had already made peace with the decision and was now simply informing the world of its new geometry. She hadn't argued. She had learned, early and thoroughly, that argument in Whitmore House operated the same way water operated against stone. It made noise, it created the impression of progress, and it moved nothing. So she had spent 3 months preparing herself the way you prepared for a procedure you couldn't avoid, with information. She'd read everything available about Ravenshade, the military record, which was long and distinguished and occasionally horrifying in its efficiency. The legal proceedings he'd brought against 3 separate noble houses, not for personal grievance, her sources clarified, but for corruption that had been bleeding the duchy's southern trade routes for a decade. The men he'd ruined. The men who'd tried to ruin him and found the attempt considerably more costly than anticipated. The rumors, which she treated as data points rather than truth, though even discounted, they painted a coherent picture. The Iron Duke. Cold. Calculating. Capable of patience in pursuit of an outcome that would have exhausted lesser men. Never cruel without purpose. Never merciful without purpose either. What she had not prepared for was the moment, 20 minutes ago, when he'd looked up from whatever conversation he was not having and found her watching him and held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before returning his attention to the room. 3 seconds was not a long time. 3 seconds was exactly long enough. She hadn't looked away first. She didn't know why. Possibly because something in her had decided, in that corridor between knowing something and actually living inside it, that looking away would establish a dynamic she'd be living with for the rest of her life. Her mother appeared at her elbow, smelling of rose water and anxiety. "Stop staring at him." I wasn't staring. You were cataloging him like a ledger entry. That's a different activity. Her mother's hand found her arm. Not rough, just firm, the grip of someone steering a ship. He's going to be your husband in 4 hours. You might consider demonstrating some warmth. He doesn't look like a man who needs warmth from strangers. You won't be a stranger in 4 hours either. Her mother's voice dropped, acquiring the specific texture it got when she was saying something she believed and wished she didn't have to. Celia, whatever you think of this, whatever you feel, you will conduct yourself with grace. You will not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder for whom? A pause. For everyone. Celia looked at her mother then, really looked, the way she'd stopped allowing herself to do years ago because it produced an ache she had no useful place to put. Her mother was 51 and had been beautiful once and was still elegant, which was a different and in some ways more expensive thing. She had married for alliance too. She had made her peace with it, or made something that resembled peace from enough distance that the distinction stopped mattering. I understand what this is, Celia said. I'm not going to make a scene. I know you're not. Her mother released her arm. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly. Older than guilt. That's what worries me. The ceremony was held at midnight, which was tradition in the northern houses. Something about the night being an honest witness, stripped of daylight's flattery, seeing the thing as it was. Celia had always thought midnight weddings sounded romantic in theory and were, in practice, simply cold. The chapel attached to Whitmore House had been built for aesthetics rather than warmth, all soaring stone and minimal insulation, and by the time she walked the aisle, her hands were almost numb inside her gloves. Her father walked beside her. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead at the altar and at the man standing beside it, and his expression was the particular blankness of someone concentrating very hard on not feeling something specific. She looked at the man instead. Alaric Ravenshade stood the way she supposed he stood everywhere, straight, composed, utterly without fidget. He was watching her approach with that modulated expression, not cold, not warm, but present in a way that felt different from how most people were present. Most people, when they watched you, were already preparing their reaction, preloading their response, thinking 2 exchanges ahead. His attention didn't feel like that. It felt like assessment without agenda, like he was genuinely looking at what was actually there. It was, Celia thought, the most unsettling form of respect she had ever experienced. She reached the altar. Her father put her hand in Alaric's and stepped back, and she felt the moment of transfer with a precision that she would spend years understanding. Alaric's hand was large and warm and dry. He held her hand with exactly enough pressure, not possessive, not tentative, calibrated. She thought, this is a man who has thought about how he holds things. The ceremony was brief. The words were old and carried the weight of repetition, worn smooth by 1,000 years of people standing in cold stone rooms, making promises in the dark. She said what she was supposed to say. He said what he was supposed to say. His voice was low and even, and he did not look away from her face while he said it, and she found that she did not look away from his. When the ceremony ended and the chaplain offered the traditional benediction, Alaric leaned slightly, fractionally, toward her and said very quietly, "You're cold." It took her a moment to understand it wasn't an observation about her temperament. "The chapel," she said. "I know." He drew her hand through his arm as they turned to face the assembled witnesses. "We won't stay long." They did not stay long. The wedding banquet was lavish in the way that financial desperation made things lavish. All surface, all spectacle. Nothing wasted on the private experiences that didn't display well. Celia sat beside her husband at the head of the long table and watched her family perform prosperity with the studied ease of people who had been performing it for so long they'd half convinced themselves of its truth. Alaric ate sparingly and spoke when addressed and deflected personal questions with the smooth efficiency of someone who had developed deflection into a genuine art form. She watched him do it. The slight redirect, the question answered with a different question, the response that was technically complete and substantively empty, and recognized the technique because she used a version of it herself. "You're doing it," she said during a gap in the noise, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. He turned to look at her. "Doing what?" "Answering questions by not answering them." A pause. Not the pause of someone caught, the pause of someone deciding whether to be direct or deflect. She watched him choose. Yes. Why? Because most questions at events like this aren't actually requests for information. He reached for his water glass. They're requests for performance. I don't perform well. You're performing right now. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I'm sitting in a chair. The bar is different. Celia looked down at her plate. Her food was arranged beautifully, and she had no appetite at all. How long before we leave for Ravenshade? 3 days. We'll stay here while the roads are assessed. The northern passes had ice last week. He paused. If you'd prefer more time with your family before the journey, I can extend it. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same attentive quality, that absence of preloaded expectation. No, she said. 3 days is enough. Bam. The ducal chambers prepared for her in Whitmore House were on the 3rd floor, the best rooms in the house, which meant they were the rooms that had been renovated most recently and therefore contained the smallest number of things that were quietly falling apart. She sat in front of the vanity mirror while her maid removed the wedding veil, pins coming out one by one, the whole elaborate structure dismantling with surprising speed into something that looked considerably less impressive than it had going on. She had been married for 4 hours. The weight of it sat in her chest in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Not grief, not quite, but something adjacent to grief. The feeling of a door closing, not violently, just finally. Her maid finished and asked if there was anything else she needed, and Celia said no, thank you, you can go. The room went quiet. She sat for a moment with herself in the mirror. 20 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, a face her mother had always called striking rather than beautiful, which was the kind of assessment that stuck. She was not a woman who inspired poetry or caused men to behave irrationally. She was a woman who noticed things, who moved through rooms with a precision that came from a childhood spent reading atmospheres the way other children read stories. She had learned very early that the most important information in any room was never what was being said, a knock at the connecting door. Not the door to the hallway, the door that connected to the Duke's chambers. She stood, crossed the room, opened it. Alaric stood on the other side, still in his wedding coat, which he had not removed, which told her something. He was holding 2 glasses of something amber-colored, and he held one out to her without preamble. Brandy, he said, if you want it. She took it. He didn't move to enter the room. She didn't move to invite him in. They stood in the doorway in a state of mutual suspension, which felt, she thought, entirely appropriate to what this was. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. This marriage was arranged for reasons that have nothing to do with you as a person. Your father needed the alliance. I needed a fractional pause. The appearance of stability that a legitimate marriage provides in the current political climate. Neither of us had significant choice in this. I understand that. She watched him. Are you apologizing? No. Apologies are for things done wrong. This was done, practically. He held his glass without drinking. What I'm saying is that I have no intention of making your life smaller than it needs to be. You'll have full authority over the household staff. You'll have access to the estate accounts. You'll have your own apartments and your own time, and no requirement to perform domesticity for an audience. The last phrase landed with unexpected precision. You heard that. I hear most things. She looked at the brandy in her hand, the amber of it, the particular way it caught the candlelight. And in return, nothing that isn't freely given. Something about the way he said it, flat, unornamented, with the quality of a thing stated rather than offered, made her chest tighten for reasons she couldn't immediately name. She'd grown up around men who said things like that and meant various other things by them. He said it the way you said a fact. Why are you telling me this tonight? He looked at her, the winter river eyes. Because you spent the entire banquet sitting beside me like you were expecting the floor to give way. And I thought, another pause, longer this time, the kind that felt like something being carefully done, that it might be useful to know it won't. Celia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, how did you end up with the reputation you have? Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. Which reputation? The Iron Duke. the destroyer of enemies. Men who crossed him found the experience more costly than anticipated. She held his gaze. How much of it is true? He looked at her for a long moment. Enough, he said. And the rest? Useful fiction. He drank his brandy then, the first time she'd seen him drink anything all evening. Fear is a more efficient deterrent than evidence. You make an example of 3 men the right way, with the right audience, and you don't have to make an example of 100 others. That's, she started. Ruthless, he said. Yes. I was going to say strategic. The corner of his mouth moved again. Still not a smile. Still something. Go to sleep, Celia. We have 3 days before the real work begins. He pulled the connecting door closed. She stood in the middle of her chambers holding a glass of brandy, listening to his footsteps cross the room beyond, and thought, he said my name. He had not said her name once during the ceremony. Not during dinner. Not during any of the polite and careful exchanges of the evening. He'd said it now, standing in a doorway, after a conversation no one else had heard. She didn't know what to do with that. She drank the brandy, which was very good, and went to bed. Ravenshade Manor was 3 days' hard travel north of Whitmore, through country that got progressively less interested in comfort as the altitude increased. The lowland estates with their manicured grounds and managed vistas gave way, gradually and then suddenly, to landscape that did not appear to care about being looked at. Stone hills, thick stands of dark pine, rivers that moved with the particular purposeful aggression of water that had somewhere to be. Celia rode in the carriage for the first day, watching the scenery change through the window, and then on the second day, moved by some restlessness she couldn't fully account for, asked one of the outriders if she could borrow his horse. There was a silence. Then Alaric, who was riding slightly ahead and had apparently heard, turned in his saddle and looked at her. Can you ride? I grew up in the country. A pause. He gestured to the outrider, who dismounted with the expression of a man experiencing several emotions at once. Celia swung up without difficulty, settled, adjusted her skirts, and brought the horse alongside Alaric's. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. What? She said. Nothing. He turned back to the road. You sit a horse well. They rode in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable the way she'd expected it to be. He seemed genuinely content with quiet, not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say, but the silence of someone who had decided what to say hadn't yet been worth saying. Tell me about the manor, she said eventually. What do you want to know? What it's actually like, not the official version. He considered this with the same deliberate quality he seemed to bring to everything. Old. The original structure was built 4 centuries ago. It's been expanded 3 times, once well, once badly, and once by my grandfather who had strong opinions about windows and was right to have them. He paused. The north wing is always cold in winter. The east gardens are currently overgrown because the head gardener died 2 years ago, and I haven't yet found someone whose plans for the space I trust. The library is extensive and unorganized, and I've been meaning to address that for approximately 5 years. Why haven't you? Because reorganizing a library requires spending an extended period in one place with no urgent crisis demanding attention. That period has not yet occurred. She looked at the side of his face. The light was different up here, harder, more direct, no flattery of diffused lowland haze. Is there always an urgent crisis? There is always something. A beat. That's not complaint, it's the nature of what I do. What do you do, specifically? He glanced at her. The look had a particular quality, not guarded exactly, more like evaluating how much she actually wanted the answer versus how much she thought she should ask. Specifically, he said, I manage a duchy of 300,000 people, 2 mountain passes that represent the primary northern trade routes for 1/3 of the kingdom's goods, a military garrison that is perpetually underfunded by the crown and requires constant private supplementation, a judicial system that was actively corrupted by 2 of my predecessors and is still being repaired, and a network of political relationships with neighboring houses that require maintenance the way old buildings require maintenance, constant, unglamorous, and immediately consequential if neglected. A pause. And before you ask, yes, the corruption prosecutions were necessary. No, I don't regret them. And yes, the men I ruined had families who are now in reduced circumstances, and I think about that. Celia absorbed this. You think about it. I'm not indifferent to consequence. Something in his voice changed, minor, almost imperceptible, like a single note shifting the quality of a chord. Being willing to do hard things isn't the same as not knowing what hard things cost. She rode beside him in silence for a while. You've thought about how you'd explain this to someone, she said. He looked at her. Excuse me? That answer, it was organized. You've had the argument with yourself, possibly many times. Another long pause. The trees on either side of the road thickened, the light dropping. He looked forward, jaw set in a way she was beginning to understand as thinking rather than irritation. Yes, he said finally. I have. Do you always win? I always end up in the same place. His voice was completely level. Whether that's winning depends on the day. Ravenshade Manor appeared around a long curve in the road in the late afternoon of the third day, and Celia understood immediately why it was not described in poetry. It was enormous and entirely honest about what it was. No attempt at grace, no nod toward the decorative traditions of the southern estates. Stone, towers, a wall that had been built to mean business and still looked like it did. The main house rose behind it in stages, each addition identifiable by its period. The architecture of 4 centuries layered in a way that shouldn't have cohered and mostly didn't, except for some quality of scale that made the whole thing feel inevitable, like a mountain range. Not beautiful, but inarguable. She stood in the carriage doorway and looked at it. It's very large, she said. Yes. And very... I know. She glanced at him. He was watching her watch the manor with the careful attention he brought to things, and she had the sudden clear sense that he actually cared what she thought of it. Not in the way of a man seeking approval, in the way of a man who had lived somewhere long enough to become inseparable from it, and was now watching someone else see it for the first time, wondering what they saw. It looks like it's been standing longer than most of the reasons it was built, she said. A silence. Yes, he said quietly. Yes. The staff was assembled in the forecourt. 30 people in neat lines, serious-faced, appraising her with the particular intelligence of people who understood that the household's quality of life had just acquired a new variable. She walked the line with Alaric beside her and didn't perform warmth and didn't perform authority either, just looked at each person with genuine attention and said their name back after the housekeeper gave it. And by the third name she could see the shift. The minute recalibration of people reassessing a situation they'd already made assumptions about. Alaric noticed. She knew he noticed because he said nothing, which was how she was beginning to understand he registered things he approved of. Her apartments were in the east wing. Large, high-ceilinged, cold in the way the north wing apparently was cold, but with better rugs. The furniture was old and serious and had the quality of things that had been chosen for use rather than display. Her maid had come ahead with their luggage and had already begun the work of making the rooms legible as someone's space. She stood at the window looking out at the overgrown east gardens and the dark tree line beyond, and the first stars beginning their appearance over the northern hills, and she thought about what had actually happened in the last 4 days. The ceremony, the doorway conversation, the horse, the 3-day ride through changing landscape beside a man who answered her questions with something that felt, the more she considered it, like radical honesty rather than performance. She didn't trust it yet. She had not lived long enough in the world to trust something clean on first encounter. But she noticed it. A knock at her door. Not the connecting door this time, the outer door. Come in. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin, 50s, direct eyes, the bearing of someone who had run a large household through several kinds of difficulty and intended to keep doing so. She held a small wooden box. His Grace asked me to give you this, my lady. He said to tell you, she checked her expression, that the library is yours and the keys inside the box. He said you'd probably want to start before he's had a chance to organize it, and you might as well have access. Celia looked at the box. He said that? He said you'd likely want the mess rather than wait for the order. His words. She took the box, turned it over in her hands. Thank you, Mrs. Aldrin. The housekeeper left. Celia opened the box. The key was heavy iron, old, worn smooth by use, and beneath it a single folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, in a hand that was precise and angular and entirely without ornamentation. The south wall, third shelf from the floor, eastern half. That's where I stopped trying to organize it and started just putting things where there was room. Start there if you want to understand what the library actually contains versus what the catalog says. A. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the box with the key and set it on the window ledge where the light would find it in the morning. She found the library the next day. It was exactly as described, extensive, unorganized, and in the particular way of spaces that had been lived in rather than curated, deeply interesting. She spent 3 hours in it before she found the section he'd referenced. The south wall, third shelf, eastern half. The books there were, eclectic was not the word. Chaotic was not the word either. They were the books of someone who read across disciplines without apologizing for the transitions. Military history, beside botanical catalogs, beside a philosophical treatise, she recognized as having been considered subversive enough to be quietly removed from public circulation about 15 years ago. A collection of letters, published, not personal, between two statesmen whose dispute had shaped the Northern Territory Agreement 60 years ago. A legal text with handwritten marginalia so dense the printed text was nearly obscured in places. She pulled the legal text and sat on the floor with it and read the marginalia. It was an argument, an extended, rigorous, sometimes ferocious argument conducted over what appeared to be several years, the handwriting changing with age, slightly looser, slightly more abbreviated as time went on, the way people's handwriting changed as they stopped having to perform legibility for others. Arguing with the author, arguing with himself, asking questions in the margins, and then, pages later, answering them with an asperity that implied he'd changed his mind and was irritated about it. She was still on the floor when the door opened. Alaric stopped when he saw her. She was sitting with her back against the shelves, the legal text open across her knees, completely unaware of what time it had become. "It's past noon," he said. She looked up. The light had changed. She had not noticed the light change. "I found the marginalia." He looked at the book. Something moved in his face, brief and private and quickly controlled. "Which volume?" "Hartwell's Territorial Statutes, the 3rd edition." She looked down at the page she was on. "You spent 3 years arguing about the definition of beneficial occupation in the 2nd chapter." A pause. He crossed the room and crouched down to look at the page without taking the book. His face was very close to hers. She did not move away. "I was 26, he said. "I was wrong about the Eastern Clause. I came to that conclusion eventually." He pointed to a note in the bottom margin, cramped and fierce. "Wrong. You were wrong. The application is not symmetric, and you should have known." "That's me. Figuring it out." "You wrote to yourself." "I wrote to the version of me that made the error." He stood. It felt more honest than pretending the error hadn't been made. Celia looked at the page, then she looked up at him. He was watching her with that attentive quality again. "Mrs. Aldrin says dinner is in an hour," he said. "I'll be there." He nodded, turned to go. "Alaric." He turned back. The name in her mouth, she hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it. "Thank you," she said. "For the key." He looked at her for a moment, the winter river eyes. Whatever was moving in them, she couldn't name it yet. Not yet. "You're welcome," he said, and left. She did not see him the next morning. He rode out before dawn to meet with his garrison commander. She heard the hoofbeats from her window and lay awake afterward in the gray pre-light, listening to the manor breathe. It was an old sound, settling wood, wind in the north wing passages, the distant mechanism of the stable clocks. She came downstairs at 8 to find Mrs. Aldrin in the corridor outside the breakfast room with the look that Celia had already learned to read as containing information. "My lady, Lord Carvel's messenger arrived an hour ago." "Who is Lord Carvel?" "He holds the estate to the southeast. He has been—" Mrs. Aldrin chose her words with the precision of someone who understood that even the housekeeper's vocabulary was political, a consistent presence in the duchy's affairs. "What does that mean?" "It means he has expressed interest in the duchy's affairs in ways that have occasionally been to the duchy's disadvantage." Celia looked at her. And he sent a messenger. He sent a letter. Mrs. Aldrin produced it. Addressed to you, my lady. She took it. The seal was ornate, old money presenting itself, announcing its age before its content. She opened it in the breakfast room, standing, not sitting. Lady Ravenshade, I write to welcome you to the northern country and to express the hope that your husband's particular method of conducting business will benefit, in time, from the moderating influence that a thoughtful wife can provide. It is my belief that the Duke's recent legal actions have created considerable instability in a region that might otherwise enjoy greater cooperation between its principal houses. I look forward, in due course, to making your acquaintance. Yours in neighborly goodwill, Lord Edric Carvel. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases, put it in her pocket, and ate her breakfast. She was still thinking about the letter when Alaric returned at midday, moving through the front hall with the particular quality of controlled urgency she was beginning to recognize. Not rushing, never rushing, but very present, whatever he'd been doing still visible in the set of his shoulders. He looked at her in the hall and stopped. What happened? Nothing happened. I received a letter. She held it out. He took it, read it. His face did not change in any way she could specifically identify, but the atmosphere around him changed. That quality she'd noticed at the banquet, the air before a storm. When did this arrive? This morning. She watched him. He wrote to me. I know why he wrote to you. He thinks I'm manageable. Alaric looked up from the letter. Something moved in his eyes. He thinks, Celia said carefully, that a young wife who is politically isolated in an unfamiliar household will be more susceptible to the kind of influence he couldn't exercise over you directly. She paused. He's trying to create a channel. A long silence. How long have you understood politics? He said. Long enough. She met his gaze. What do you want to do about it? He folded the letter, held it. Something worked through his expression in a way she hadn't seen yet. Not calculation exactly, but something adjacent to it, edged with something she couldn't name. I want to know what you want to do about it, he said. Celia blinked. In her entire life, no one had ever asked her that. She was still processing the fact of the question when the outer door opened and a rider came through with mud on his coat and urgency in his face, and before the man had taken 3 steps into the hall, she saw Alaric's entire posture shift. Not dramatically, just a degree, a frequency change, and knew from that shift alone that whatever the rider was carrying was not good news. Your Grace. The rider stopped, looked briefly at Celia with the look of a man assessing whether to speak in front of her. I have a message from Lord Vane at court, Alaric said, without looking away from Celia. Speak. Lord Vane says, the rider steadied himself. The council has moved. The vote to restrict Northern Duchy trade licensing has passed, 7 votes to 4. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had a texture to it. Wait. When? Alaric said. 3 days ago. The courier took the long route because of the ice. Alaric's jaw set. A single movement. Contained, final, like a door closing. Celia stood very still and watched it and thought, this is what the Iron Duke looks like from the inside. Not the performance of ruthlessness, the actual cost of it, every decision compounding, every enemy patient, every political maneuver eventually arriving at the door you thought you'd locked. He turned to her. His face was completely controlled. I have to go back to court, he said. Within the week. She looked at him, the letter in his hand, the rider still standing there, the manor around them, enormous and cold and old. I'm coming with you, she said. A pause. Celia, Lord Carvel wrote to me this morning. The vote passed 3 days ago. Those are not separate events. She held his gaze. They're trying to reach you through me, which means I'm already in this. The only question is whether I'm in it with you or without you. The rider was looking at the floor. Mrs. Aldrin had materialized somewhere in the doorway, which meant she had heard everything, which was fine. Whatever this was had already left the realm of things that could be managed by keeping them quiet. Alaric looked at her for a long moment, the Winter River eyes. Whatever moved in them moved too deep to name. You understood this faster than men who've been at court for 20 years, he said. I had good information. The letter. The library, she said. Hartwell's territorial statutes, the Eastern Clause. She kept her voice steady. Trade licensing in the Northern Territories falls under the same jurisdictional language. 7 votes to 4 is enough to pass, but not enough to withstand a formal challenge. If the challenge is made in the right court, by the right party, within 30 days of the vote. He went completely still. I've been reading since yesterday, she said. I'm not finished yet. But you have time. If you move now. The silence stretched. Then quietly, without ceremony, you read Hartwell in a day. I read your marginalia. It was faster. Something happened in his face. Something she hadn't seen before, in any of its modulations. Not calculation, not controlled warmth, something without a name. Something that had apparently not been out in the open in a very long time, blinking in the unfamiliar light. The writer cleared his throat. Your Grace, I heard you. Alaric did not look away from Celia. Tell the stable to prepare for a court journey. 7 days. A pause. 2 carriages. The rider left. Mrs. Aldrin disappeared with that quality of accomplished invisibility. The hall was quiet. Alaric stood in front of her with the letter in his hand and whatever was happening in his face, and she stood in front of him thinking about the key in the wooden box and the marginalia in the margins and the way he'd asked, "What do you want to do about it?" Like it was a question with a real answer, and she thought, I don't know what this is. I don't know what any of this is yet. But she was beginning to think she was going to find out. 7 days, she said. 7 days, he confirmed. He turned toward the corridor, stopped, turned back. Celia. His voice was quieter now. The 30-day window, he paused, jaw working slightly, starts from the date the vote was certified, not the date the message arrived. She understood immediately. How many days have already passed? The vote was 3 days ago. The certification takes 2 days in ordinary session. His eyes were very steady. We have 25 days. 25 days to reach court. 25 days to build a legal challenge in an environment that had already demonstrated its willingness to move against them. Then we shouldn't take 7 days, she said. No, he said. We shouldn't. He walked away down the corridor. She listened to his footsteps. Even now, even in urgency, they were measured, controlled. The footsteps of a man who had decided long ago that the one thing he could not afford to lose was his own composure. She stood in the hall for a moment, alone, in the old house that had been standing longer than most of the reasons it was built. Then she went back to the library. She had 24 chapters left. She was on chapter 11, 3 hours later, when Mrs. Aldrin appeared in the library door with an expression that Celia had not seen on her face before. My lady. Her voice was careful in the way of a person carrying something fragile. A second message has arrived. It came by private courier, not the duchy's courier service. Celia looked up. Who sent it? There's no name. The housekeeper held out a small sealed envelope. The courier said only that it was urgent and for your eyes alone. She took the envelope. The housekeeper withdrew. The seal was plain wax. No crest, no identifying mark. She broke it. Inside a single line in an unfamiliar hand. He trusts you. They know it. You're not safe. She read it 3 times. The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the wind moved through the east gardens, the overgrown hedges shifting in ways that looked, in the failing afternoon light, like something large moving carefully at the edge of vision. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket, next to Lord Carvel's letter. 2 pieces of paper, 2 different hands. The same message she understood arriving from 2 directions. She was already the axis around which something was turning, and she had been turning on it since before she arrived. She opened Hartwell's territorial statutes to chapter 11. Her hands were completely steady. She did not show Alaric the second letter that night. She thought about it, sat with it through dinner, a quiet meal, just the 2 of them at one end of a table built for 20, the candlelight doing what candlelight did in old stone rooms, which was make everything look simultaneously intimate and ancient. She watched him read through the trade licensing documents she'd summarized from Hartwell while he ate, which he did without self-consciousness, and she thought about the single line in her pocket and decided, not yet. Not because she didn't trust him, she hadn't decided about trust yet, in either direction, but because the letter said they know it, They know he trusts you. And that meant the value of what she held was information, and information spent too quickly was information gone. She needed to understand first what she was holding before she decided what to do with it. What she knew, someone had sent her a warning. Someone with access to private courier services who had no crest on their seal and no name in their hand. Someone who was either genuinely trying to protect her or trying to move her. And the difference between those two things was the most important question currently available to her. What she did not know, nearly everything else. She ate her dinner. She listened to the wind work through the North Passage. She watched Alaric read and thought. He reads the way he does everything else, like it's the only thing happening. You marked 3 clauses, he said without looking up, the ones with jurisdictional ambiguity. The third one is a dead end. The beneficial occupation language was amended in the supplemental statutes, the 4th edition, not the 3rd. The amendment narrows the scope. She hadn't read the 4th edition. She made a note of that in the way she made notes of most things, without paper, internally, in the organized architecture of her own recall. Where's the 4th edition? North wall, 2nd shelf. It's behind a set of surveying maps that have no business being in a library. He turned a page. I moved them there after I finished the amendment and forgot to move them back. She looked at him, the candlelight on the side of his face, the absolute lack of performance in everything he said to her, every exchange stripped down to its actual content, like a building with no facade, just structure. When do we leave? She said. Dawn, the day after tomorrow. The road to the capital is faster by the northern route, but the northern route requires 2 days of preparation. The supply caches need checking, and the garrison needs notification. He set the document down. I sent riders this afternoon. You made the decision before I came to dinner. Yes. You told me 7 days. I was wrong. You were right. He said it without inflection, without the particular quality men often had when they admitted error. The defensiveness, the need to contextualize it into something smaller. Just, I was wrong. You were right. Next, she thought about the letter in her pocket. He trusts you. They know it. Lord Carvel's letter, she said. What about it? He's not acting alone. The language, the Duke's recent legal actions have created considerable instability. That's not a man expressing personal grievance. That's a man speaking for a position. Alaric looked up from his documents for the first time. The vote, she continued, 7-4. That's not a natural majority in a council that has historically run 3-2 against northern interests. Someone organized it. She kept her voice level. Carvel wrote to me on the same day the vote passed, before news of the vote could have reached him by ordinary courier. The silence had a different quality now. He knew it was coming, Alaric said. He knew it was coming, which means he's connected to the council members who organized it and connected closely enough to know the timing. She paused. He wrote to me because he expected you to leave for court immediately and leave me here. He expected me to be isolated and manageable within the week. Alaric set his documents down entirely. He looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the controlled warmth, not the careful assessment, something more direct, something that had weight behind it. How long have you been working this through? He said. Since the letter arrived. You said nothing at the time. I needed the afternoon to be sure. She met his gaze. I'm sure now. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the grate shifted, throwing new shadows. Carvel has been a problem for 11 years, he said. He controls 3 of the southeastern estates whose trade licenses feed into the northern route. I removed his brother-in-law from the licensing board 4 years ago for irregularities. He's been cultivating grievances since. He's been cultivating patience, she said. Grievances don't organize a 7-4 council vote. Patience does. Another silence. This one felt like something settling. You are not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He looked at her for a long moment, the winter river eyes doing whatever they did when they were actually moving. Someone who would need 6 months to understand the landscape. I grew up in it. Different duchy, same mechanics. She looked down at her plate. The food had gone cold while they talked, which felt appropriate. My father's house ran on political debt for 20 years. I learned to read the ledger young. And your father, sold the ledger's most valuable entry to settle it. She said it without heat. Which is how I'm here. The words sat on the table between them. She had not meant to say it quite that plainly, but there it was. Alaric said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with softness. For what it's worth, the terms I negotiated with your father were his idea. The alliance structure, the settlement. I requested a marriage that would benefit both houses. He determined the specific arrangement. I know. She looked up. I'm not placing it at your feet. I'm placing it honestly, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. The fire. The old room. The documents between them that represented a problem with a 25-day window and a network of enemies she was only beginning to map. Go to sleep, she said. We have a long road. Something moved in his face, that thing without a name that had appeared in the hall and disappeared quickly. It appeared again now and stayed a moment longer. Good night, Celia, he said. They rode out before the sun was fully above the tree line. The court journey took 4 days instead of 7, which was accomplished by riding hard and sleeping briefly and stopping only when the horses required it rather than when the passengers did. Celia did not complain about this. She was not built for complaining about discomfort. She'd discovered early in life that comfort was a variable and endurance was a constant, and the former depended on circumstances while the latter depended only on decision. She rode beside Alaric for most of it. They talked when there was something to say and were quiet when there wasn't. And she noticed that he had the particular quality of people who had spent a great deal of time alone. He did not feel the need to fill silence, and he did not interpret silence as hostility. It was a quality she recognized because she had it too, and she could count on one hand the number of people in her life who hadn't found it disconcerting. On the second night, stopped at a garrison outpost in the foothills, she sat across from him at a plank table in a room that smelled of horses and pine resin and asked him directly about the 3 men whose houses he'd ruined. He looked at her over his cup. Why? Because I want to know the full version, not the version people tell to explain why they're afraid of you. A long pause. The garrison around them was quiet. The soldiers had made themselves scarce with the efficiency of people who had learned that their commander's privacy was a thing you respected absolutely. The first, he said, was Lord Davin Ashcroft. He held the licensing authority for the Western Mountain Passage. He'd been taking a percentage from every trade caravan for 9 years. Not tax, not fee. Personal extraction, undocumented. The merchants couldn't report it because he controlled the magistrate appointments in that district. His voice was completely flat. I documented it over 18 months. I brought the case to the Crown Court. He was stripped of his titles and his estate was forfeited. And his family. His wife and daughters were given a modest settlement from the forfeited estate. Enough to live on. They moved to the coastal provinces. He paused. I made sure the settlement was structured so it couldn't be touched by his creditors. He had significant personal debts that would have claimed everything otherwise. She absorbed this. You protected them. I protected them from his consequences. That's different from protecting them from mine. The second, Lord Pembroke, similar corruption, more sophisticated. He'd built a network of false documentation, false cargo manifests, false duty assessments. He'd been doing it for 6 years and had 3 council members on his payroll to prevent investigation. His jaw worked slightly. I had to remove all 3 council members as well. That's where the current council composition comes from. The replacements were my nominations, which is why Carvel's faction has been building toward this vote for 4 years. You knew they would. I calculated they would try eventually. I calculated the trade revenue recovered from ending Pembroke's operation would outweigh the political cost of the council restructure. He set his cup down. I was right about the revenue. I underestimated the patience. And the third, Alaric was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that had different content from his ordinary quiet. Lord Serwick, he said, he didn't have a corruption operation. He had a private prison. His voice stayed flat. In the Eastern Mining District, men who fell into debt to the company he owned were imprisoned on fabricated criminal charges and used as unpaid labor. 12 men over 7 years. The room was very still. I didn't bring that one to the Crown Court, he said. The Crown Court process takes 2 years minimum and requires cooperation from local magistrates who were also compromised. I handled it directly. What does that mean? He looked at her steadily. It means I used every tool available to me that was faster than the legal system. Did anyone die? No? A pause. Serwick is alive. He is in considerably reduced circumstances and has not held a position of authority since. The 12 men were released and compensated from his forfeited assets. Another pause. Briefer. Serwick's family was not protected. He had no family who hadn't participated in the operation's management. Celia sat with this for a moment. The 3 stories. The calculation running underneath each of them. Not cold calculation, or not only cold calculation, but the specific calculation of a man who had looked at what the system could do and what it couldn't do and had made decisions in the gap, and had lived with those decisions long enough to stop pretending they were simple. You told me all of that, she said. You asked. Most people would have given me the version that made them look better. He looked at her. I need you to understand what kind of man I am. You're about to walk into a court that already considers you a liability. You need accurate information. The word liability landed differently than she expected. Not because it stung, she'd been called worse things in softer language, but because of the already. Already. Before she'd said a word in that court, already the thing they wanted to use against him. They're going to try to separate us, she said. Yes. They'll approach me privately. Offer something, sympathy, alliance, information. Yes. And when I don't take it, they'll escalate. He looked at her for a long moment. When you don't take it. I told you, I'm not manageable. Something moved across his face. Slow and private and entirely without calculation for once. Just the thing itself, whatever it was, traveling across his expression like weather crossing open ground. No, he said. You're not. Jed. The capital was everything the Northern Duchy was not. Loud, layered, performing itself at every scale simultaneously. The streets outside the court district were noise and commerce, and the specific smell of too many people making too many decisions in too small a space. The court district itself was the same noise compressed and refined into something that looked like order, carriages and livery and stone facades that announced their owner's importance in the architectural language of serious money. Ravenshade's townhouse was in the older part of the district, on a street where the buildings were narrower and the facades were less decorative, and everything looked like it had stopped trying to prove something about 50 years ago. She liked it immediately. The staff here was smaller, a skeleton crew maintained for ducal visits rather than permanent residents. They assembled in the front hall with the efficient anxiety of people who had received 4 days' notice instead of the usual week. She introduced herself briefly and clearly and moved through the necessary acknowledgments with a speed that she could see surprised them. Alaric was already in the study with his legal counsel by the time she'd finished. She could hear the voices through the closed door, 3 of them, the discussion already running at the pace of people who had urgent problems and limited time. She went to the study door and knocked. A pause from inside. Come in. She entered. 3 men at the table. Alaric and 2 others, one older, the legal counsel she'd expected, and one younger whose bearing had the quality of someone who had spent years managing other people's political emergencies. Both looked at her with the specific assessment of men recalibrating a situation they'd already mapped. Celia, Alaric's voice was level. This is Counsel Harwick and my political secretary, Dorian Fell. She nodded at both. Then she put Lord Carvel's letter and the unsigned letter on the table. Silence. Dorian Fell picked up Carvel's letter first. Read it. Set it down with the controlled expression of a man who had just had a theory confirmed expensively. Counsel Harwick picked up the second letter. His expression changed differently. Faster, less controlled. When did this arrive? The day before we left the manor. Private courier, no crest, no name. Who else has seen it? No one. Harwick looked at Alaric. Something passed between them that had years of professional history in it. Someone in the court sent this, Fell said. He was still looking at the letter. Someone with knowledge of Carvel's operation and access to private courier routes, he paused. Someone who chose to warn your wife rather than warn you. Because warning me directly would have been traceable, Alaric said. And warning her is deniable. She's new. She has no established communication network. A message to her has no clear origin story. His voice was completely even. He looked at Celia. You understood this. I understood it might be genuine or it might be a move, I held it until I understood the context better. Harwick was watching her with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone revising a set of assumptions in real time, doing the visible work of it without embarrassment. Lady Ravenshade, the 4th edition of Hartwell. The Beneficial Occupation Amendment narrows the jurisdictional scope in a way that affects Clause 3 of the Northern Licensing Statutes. The 30-day challenge window applies to the certification date, not the passage date. You have 21 days remaining. She paused. The challenge needs to be filed in the Crown Commercial Court, not the Parliamentary Court. Alaric's enemies have relationships with the Parliamentary Bench. The Commercial Court has been less recently managed. The room was quiet. Belle looked at Alaric, a look that communicated something in a frequency she couldn't fully read yet. Alaric said nothing. He was watching her in that way again, the way that felt like being actually seen rather than assessed, which was a distinction she was still learning to hold without flinching. "File in the Commercial Court," he said to Harwick, "within the week." The first approach came 3 days later. Lady Serena Vane, wife of the Lord Vane, who had sent Alaric the warning message, which made her either an ally's spouse or a very elegant trap, appeared at the front door of the townhouse at 11 in the morning with a calling card and an invitation to take tea. Celia accepted. She sent no message to Alaric's study. Lady Vane was 50-something and had the particular quality of women who had survived several decades of court life with their intelligence intact. Watchful, precise, and in possession of a warmth that was real but not unconditional. She sat in the townhouse's front parlor and drank her tea and said nothing directly for approximately 20 minutes, which Celia allowed without impatience, because the silence had information in it. "You're not what anyone expected," Lady Vane said finally. "So I've been told." They expected, a pause, chosen carefully, someone easier. "They should have done more research," Lady Vane smiled. It was a real smile. "Lord Carvel has been making inquiries about your family, specifically about the financial situation at Whitmore House." Celia set down her cup. "He wants leverage. He wants a story. A young wife from a ruined house, married for desperation. The suggestion being," Lady Vane's voice was entirely neutral, "that your loyalty to the Duke might be purchasable, or at minimum, shakeable. And your interest in telling me this. My husband believes the challenge your husband files this week will succeed. If it succeeds, the council faction behind the vote loses its primary trade mechanism. That faction has been making Lord Vane's life difficult for 3 years." She met Celia's gaze. "We have compatible interests. Or you've been sent to map mine." A pause. Lady Vane looked at her with an expression that had shifted. Less performance, more actual. "Yes, that possibility exists. You'd be a fool not to hold it." "I'm not a fool." "No." Lady Vane set down her own cup. "The unsigned letter," Celia went very still, "was sent by my husband," Lady Vane said. "He couldn't sign it because 3 of the men in Carvel's network have access to the court's internal correspondence. He needed it to reach you without a trail." She paused. "He apologizes for the alarm." Celia looked at her. The parlor. The tea. The 50-year-old woman who had just revealed something that was either the truth or an exceptionally well-constructed version of it. "Tell Lord Vane," she said carefully, "that I received his message, and that the alarm was useful." Lady Vane nodded once. "There's one more thing." Her voice changed. Not dramatic, just a degree quieter, a degree more direct. "The men behind this vote have decided that the challenge will fail not because of law, but because of what happens to you before it's heard." She held Celia's gaze. "They intend to move against you personally. Carvel's network has connections to a man named Thresh, who handles," she chose her word, "the kind of problems that can't be handled through official channels." The parlor was very quiet. "When?" Celia said. "Before the commercial court hearing. Within 2 weeks." She paused. "We don't know the specific form, only the intent." Celia sat with this for a moment, the information landing in her chest with the particular weight of things that changed the shape of everything around them. She thought about Alaric, about the study where he was working right now, 3 doors away, with Harwick and Fell and a legal argument that was precise and correct and entirely insufficient against a man named Thresh, who handled problems that couldn't be handled through official channels. She thought, he doesn't know. And then, with a clarity that surprised her with its steadiness, he is going to know, today. She stood. Lady Vane, thank you for coming. Lady Ravenshade. The older woman stood as well, and for a moment her expression did something entirely unguarded. Something almost like concern, which from a woman who had spent 30 years at court was worth more than most people's effusive declarations. Be careful. Celia looked at her. That's not the plan. She walked to the study door. She knocked. She entered without waiting. Alaric looked up from the table. One look at her face and he was standing. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it. Lady Vane, Lord Vane's letter, the name Thresh, the timeline of 2 weeks, the intent. She said it in order, without drama, without the particular performance of urgency that made people hear the fear instead of the information. He listened without interrupting. His face did not change in ways she could specifically track, but the atmosphere changed. The air in the room changed. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You took that meeting alone. Yes. You could have told me she was coming. I needed to read her without you in the room. Your presence changes how people present themselves to you. Another silence. Fell and Harwick were absolutely still on the other side of the table. She's telling the truth, Alaric said. About Vane. About the letter. I believe so. And Thresh. Something happened in his jaw. A single movement, compressed and final. I know that name. I thought you might. He looked at her, the winter river eyes. Whatever lived in their depth had moved all the way to the surface, and it was not cold. It was nothing like cold. It was the opposite of cold. It was the thing under cold, the thing that cold had been built on top of and over and around, the thing that had needed all that architecture of control, because without it, it would have been too much. You should have told me the moment Lady Vane mentioned Thresh, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely even, and it cost him something to keep it that way. She could see the cost. I'm telling you now. You walked out of that room with that information and came directly here. Yes. Why didn't you? He stopped. His jaw worked. Why are you? He stopped again. She understood what he was trying to ask. It was not why did you tell me, and it was not why didn't you tell me sooner. It was something underneath both of those, the thing the question was actually reaching for, which was, why are you here? Why are you standing in this room choosing this? Why are you in this at all when you could have been everything Carvel expected? Manageable, isolated, a young wife from a ruined house who took the first offer of a different arrangement. She looked at him. Because you asked me what I wanted to do about it, she said. And nobody had ever asked me that before. The room was completely still. Fell looked at the table. Harwick looked at his hands. Alaric looked at her, and the thing under the cold was fully visible now. Not softness, not vulnerability in any form she'd been taught to recognize, but something rawer than either of those. Something that had not been outside in a very long time. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in both hands and looked at her. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything. Then he said, very quietly, I'm going to handle Thresh. I know. And Carvel. I know. And every single person in that network who decided that you were the easiest point of entry. His voice was still even. The evenness was the most frightening thing she had ever heard. Everyone. She put her hands over his. After the hearing, she said. Handle them after the hearing. He looked at her. His thumbs were at her temples. She could feel his pulse, or she thought she could, or she was imagining it, or it was her own pulse she was feeling, and either way it was there, rapid and real and belonging to the present moment, not the political machinery around it. After the hearing, he said. Yes. He released her, stepped back, turned to Harwick. Move the filing up. File tomorrow morning. Harwick was already reaching for his documents. Yes, Your Grace. Alaric looked at Fell. Fell nodded once, the nod of a man who understood exactly what had just shifted in the room and was already running the calculations on what it meant. He looked back at Celia. Stay in the townhouse today. I'm not asking you to hide. His voice was direct. I'm asking you to stay in the townhouse today because I need to send 3 messages and make 2 visits, and I need to know where you are while I do it. Tomorrow you can do whatever you decide to do. She looked at him. That's reasonable, she said. I know. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I practice. She turned to leave the study. Stopped. Alaric. He turned. The vote, she said. 7-4. Who was the fourth vote against? A pause. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Lord Branwick, he said. He's been on the council for 20 years. He was my father's closest advisor before he became mine. He arranged the terms of our marriage. She absorbed this, the structure of it. He voted against the restriction. He voted with me, yes. She nodded, turned to leave. Why do you ask? He said behind her. She paused with her hand on the door frame. She thought about the logic of it. The vote, the structure of the network, the fact that someone inside had been leaking information to Carvel's faction for long enough to coordinate a 7-4 result in a council that had run 2-1 against Northern interests for a decade. The fact that the person with the longest relationship to Alaric and the most comprehensive access to his political operations had voted, visibly and on record, in his favor. The best cover was always visible loyalty. She thought about it, turned it over, set it down. Nothing, she said. Go make your visits. She walked out of the study, down the hall, back toward her rooms, and the thought stayed with her, quiet and cold and patient, the way the most dangerous things always were. She was not ready to say it yet, but she was not going to forget it. 4 days while Harwick filed the commercial court challenge and the court's legal machinery accepted it with the bureaucratic indifference of a mechanism that processed paper regardless of the stakes attached. 4 days while Alaric made his visits and sent his messages and came home each evening with the controlled quality of a man managing a great deal of information simultaneously and choosing, with visible discipline, to leave most of it at the door. 4 days while Fell ran the political counter-operations that Celia was only partially briefed on, not because Alaric was excluding her, but because some of it involved methods she had specifically asked not to know the details of, and he had honored that without comment. She used the 4 days to watch Branwick. Miss. He came to the townhouse twice during that period, ostensibly to consult with Alaric about the challenge's legal strategy, which was legitimate enough that she had no grounds to raise it as suspicious. She sat in on both meetings. She was not invited. She simply appeared and no one told her to leave, which in the political vocabulary of that household meant she was welcome. Alaric glanced at her when she entered the first time, a brief assessment, and then returned his attention to Branwick without comment. Branwick was 63 years old and had the particular quality of men who had spent their lives in proximity to power without quite holding it themselves, deeply competent, deeply adapted, the kind of man whose value was invisible until the moment it was absent. He had an easy warmth that was entirely real, and also, she was increasingly certain, entirely managed. He laughed at the right moments. He expressed the right concerns. He'd served Alaric's father for 15 years and Alaric himself for 8, and he wore that history the way a well-fitted coat was worn, like it was simply part of him, unremarkable, not something you'd think to question. She watched his eyes when he didn't know she was watching. The eyes were the thing. They were a degree too still when Alaric spoke about the Carvel network. Not alarmed. A guilty man alarmed was a guilty man caught. This was something more controlled, the stillness of a person processing information they already have, confirming it against a map they've already drawn, adjusting for variables. She was not certain. She held that clearly. She was building a case from behavioral data and intuition and a 7-4 vote that didn't add up, and none of that was evidence, and all of it was something she could not ignore. On the 5th day, she told Alaric. Well, she chose the morning. He was in the east-facing study, alone, the early light coming through the windows at the angle that made the room feel almost warm. She closed the door behind her and stood across from him and said it directly. I think Branwick is the source. He went completely still. Not the thinking stillness, not the processing stillness. The other kind. The kind that came before a decision about how to respond to something that had hit a place that wasn't expecting the blow. Explain, he said. She explained. All of it. The behavioral observations, the vote, the logic of the leak, the way the Carvel network had demonstrated knowledge of Alaric's internal operations that would require a source with sustained, trusted access. She laid it out in order, without hedging but also without prosecutorial force, because this was not an argument she was trying to win. It was information she was giving him, and he could do with it what he judged appropriate. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Branwick arranged the marriage," he said. "I know. He's been with my family for 23 years. I know. If you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and we verify that, and the damage is a professional disruption I'm entirely prepared to own." She held his gaze. "But if I'm right and we don't check, the challenge fails, and Thresh moves before the hearing, and everything you've built for 8 years gets dismantled by someone who had dinner at your table every month for the better part of a decade." A long silence. The morning light, the dust in it. "Don't tell Fel," he said. "I haven't told anyone." He stood, walked to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the street below, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought about the cost of what she'd just handed him. Not the political cost, which was calculable, but the other kind, the kind that didn't show on ledgers. 23 years. She understood, in the way of someone who had learned early what institutional betrayal felt like, that it was not the same as betrayal by a stranger. A stranger's betrayal was clean. It had a clear shape. This kind of betrayal, the kind by someone who had known you young, who had sat at your father's table, who had been part of the architecture of your trust before you were old enough to consciously decide to extend it, this kind left a different mark, not in the place where you kept political calculations. In a deeper place, older than strategy. She said nothing. She let him stand at the window. After a while he turned around. His face was composed, and she understood now that composure was not the absence of what was inside. It was the decision about what to do with it. He had made the decision. "The winter banquet," he said. "The Crown hosts it in 11 days. Every major council member will be there. If Branwick is the source, that's when they move. Maximum audience, maximum political impact." "Yes," she said. "I thought the same. We don't change our behavior before then. Nothing that signals we've looked at him." "Agreed." He looked at her. The thing under the cold moving again, not surfacing this time, just present, visible the way deep water was visible through ice. "You've been carrying this for 4 days. I needed to be sure enough to say it. And now?" "I'm sure enough." He nodded once. "All right." That was all. That was the whole of it. She had handed him a potential 23-year betrayal, and he had taken it with both hands and said, "All right." And she thought, "I understand now why they call him Iron. Not because he doesn't feel things, because he has learned at enormous cost where to put them." The 11 days passed with the specific quality of time that moves too fast when you need it and too slow when you're waiting. The challenge was filed and accepted and scheduled for hearing 9 days after the banquet, which meant the banquet was the last available pressure point before the legal mechanism rendered Carvel's vote economically void. She understood the geometry of it clearly. They would move at the banquet because it was their last chance to move at all. She just didn't know the shape of the move. The Royal Winter Banquet was held in the Crown's primary reception hall, a room built, like so much of the court's architecture, to make the people inside it feel appropriately small. High ceilings, long tables, 100 candles doing their honest work of flattering everyone indiscriminately. The court arrived in its full formal weight. Every council member, every major house, the subsidiary lords who orbited the primary powers in their established patterns, the diplomatic envoys who watched everything with the professional neutrality of people paid to understand things they were not involved in. Celia wore dark blue. She had chosen it deliberately, not the softer colors she'd been advised toward, the colors that said, "Young wife, recently arrived, still learning the room." Dark blue said something different. It said, "I know what room I'm in." She stood beside Alaric at the pre-dinner reception and watched the room the way she'd been watching rooms her entire life, and what she saw was a distribution of attention that was slightly wrong. The normal pattern of a court event was a web. Attention moving outward from power centers, people tracking the primary figures and adjusting their positions accordingly. What she saw instead was a convergence. Multiple points of attention across different factions, all with a slightly elevated quality. Not staring, never staring, but oriented. Waiting. "Something's already in motion," she said quietly. Alaric, half a degree turned toward her, did not change his expression. "Where?" "Everywhere. They're all waiting for the same thing." She tracked the room without moving her head. Carvel is in the northeast corner. He hasn't looked at you once, which means he's already looked enough. Branwick? Near the fireplace. He's been talking to Lord Edminster for 20 minutes. She paused. Edminster controls the Crown's household guard assignments. A silence that lasted exactly one breath. They're not just moving against the challenge, Alaric said. His voice was completely level and entirely cold. They're moving against the evening. She thought about Thresh. The name Thresh and the phrase problems that can't be handled through official channels and the specific geometry of a room full of people waiting for something to happen. Yes, she said, stay close. I was already planning on it. Dinner was served at 8. She sat beside Alaric at the main table, and Branwick sat 4 seats down on Alaric's other side. And she watched Branwick with the peripheral focus she'd developed over years of needing to watch things without appearing to. And what she saw across the course of the meal was a man managing time. Checking his pocket watch twice. Unusual in a social setting where checking time was considered a form of rudeness. Scanning the room at intervals that were too regular to be casual. Eating almost nothing. Alaric, she understood, was watching Branwick too. They had not discussed it after the initial conversation, but she knew, the way she was beginning to know things about him that went beyond evidence, that he had spent 11 days doing exactly what she had been doing, and arriving at the same conclusions, and carrying the weight of that in the same place she'd carried her 4 days of certainty. The place that wasn't strategy, the place that was simply older and more personal than strategy could reach. The third course arrived. Wine was poured. The ambient noise of 200 people engaged in the performance of convivial dining filled the room to its appropriate level. She reached for her wine glass. The movement came from her left. Not Alaric's side, her side, a servant she didn't recognize moving with the specific economy of someone who had rehearsed a single action rather than the general flow of service work. She saw it the way you saw things you'd been trained by necessity to see. Not consciously, not as a thought, but as a physical reaction preceding thought, her body understanding what her mind was still processing. She moved, not away, toward. She turned left and her arm came up and she took the impact across her forearm instead of letting it reach Alaric, and what she felt was a line of cold fire from elbow to wrist, and then the clatter of something hitting the stone floor, and then noise. The specific noise of 200 people reacting to something that had broken the performance of normalcy. She looked down. A thin blade. Short, the kind designed for proximity. The servant was already moving, or trying to move, but Alaric's hand had closed around the man's wrist before he'd taken 2 steps, and the table had gone silent in the specific way of people who have just understood that the thing happening in front of them is real. Her arm hurt. She registered this at a distance. She registered also that she was standing, that she did not remember standing, and that Alaric was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and did not yet have words for. "I'm all right," she said. He looked at her forearm. The sleeve of her dress was dark at the cut. Not soaking, not serious, but visible. Real. He looked at it, and something happened in his face that was not composure and was not its opposite either. It was the complete temporary failure of the architecture, every layer of it, all at once. "I'm all right," she said again. Alaric. He turned to the room, and she saw it. The thing that had built the reputation. The thing the stories were made of, except that now she understood the stories had it wrong. They said he was cold. They said he was calculating. What she saw was neither of those things. What she saw was a man whose control, which had been built over years against every variety of political threat and personal cost, had just encountered the one thing it had not been built to withstand. He spoke. Not loudly. A room of 200 people, and he didn't raise his voice, and every single person heard him. "My wife was just attacked in the Crown's hall." He held the room with no visible effort, the way a very cold day held a city, not by force, but by the complete lack of resistance. In front of the full court, with a blade, he paused. "The man who arranged this is in this room. I know who he is, and I want every person seated at these tables to understand something clearly." Another pause. The silence had texture. "Anyone who moves against her, by blade, by letter, by vote, by whisper, will learn the specific and personal meaning of what it costs to make that choice. I am not speaking of legal consequence. I am speaking of myself." The room was completely still. "I am speaking," he said, "of Ravenshade." She stood beside him with her arm bleeding gently through dark blue silk and watched 200 people recalibrate simultaneously, and she thought, there it is. That's the thing under the cold. That's what all the architecture was protecting. Not power, not the duchy, not the strategic position he'd spent 8 years constructing. Her. The Crown's guard secured the attacker within minutes. Fell materialized with the speed of a man who had been waiting for an emergency and was constitutionally suited to them. Lady Vane appeared and took Celia's uninjured arm with a firmness that communicated both care and the practical wisdom of someone getting her out of the main room before she became a spectacle. Celia allowed it. Her arm throbbed with a clean, uncomplicated pain that was almost easier to process than everything else. She was in an antechamber off the main hall, her sleeve cut back and the wound being dressed by one of the crown physicians, when the door opened and Alaric came in and closed it behind him. He crossed the room without speaking and sat down next to her and looked at her arm with the expression of a man looking at something he cannot change and is not making peace with. "It's not deep," the physician said, mostly to fill the silence. Alaric said nothing. "8 stitches at most," the physician continued. Alaric looked at Celia. His face was still undone in that way. Not dramatically, not in any form the court outside this door would have recognized from his public face, but unmistakably, privately undone. And she understood that he was letting her see it, which was a different thing from her simply observing it. "I told you I was all right," she said. "I heard you." "You don't look like you believe me." "I believe you." His jaw was set. "That's not the issue." She looked at him. "What's the issue?" A long pause. The physician worked quietly and quickly, with the competence of someone who understood that the room had something in it that didn't require his participation. "The issue," Alaric said, "is that you moved before I did. Because you were watching the room, and you saw it, and you reacted faster than anyone else at that table." His voice was controlled. The control was costing him visibly. "Because you have been watching rooms and reacting before anyone else since before you were old enough to understand why." She didn't say anything. "The issue," he continued, "is that I've been doing this for 20 years, and you've been doing it for your entire life. And the reason you've been doing it for your entire life is because no one in it ever made it safe for you to stop." He stopped. His jaw worked. "And I intend to be, the kind of man who changes that. And tonight I failed at it on the first serious test." The physician had finished. He excused himself with quiet efficiency, and the door clicked shut behind him. She looked at Alaric, the undone face, the controlled voice, the thing he'd just said, which was not an apology because it was something more specific than an apology. It was a statement of intent that acknowledged failure without surrendering the intent, which was the hardest kind of honesty available to people who took their own commitments seriously. She thought about the blade, the cold line of it, the fraction of a second between seeing and moving. She thought about 20 years of training herself to see and move. Every room cataloged, every exit noted, every atmosphere read for its content rather than its performance. She thought about what it would mean to stop doing that. She thought, not yet, not here, not until this is finished. "We have a problem," she said. He looked at her. "I know, not Thresh, not Carvel." She held his gaze. "The attacker is in the Crown's custody. Within an hour, someone from Carvel's network is going to reach him and he will stop talking, permanently or otherwise. Fell is already, but that's not the problem either." She steadied herself. "Alaric, when you spoke to the room, you told them you knew who arranged it." A beat of silence. "I needed to control the room," he said. "I know why you said it, but Branwick heard you say it." She watched the comprehension move across his face. "He knows you know, which means whatever he was holding back, whatever he was protecting, whatever his arrangement with Carvel's network required him not to burn until absolutely necessary, he is burning it tonight, right now, while we're sitting in this room." He was already standing. "If he moves the documents," she said, "the challenge evidence, the filing supports in Harwick's office." He was at the door. "If he gets to Harwick before—" "Go," she said. He looked at her. "One moment." The undone face and the Winter River eyes, and something in them that she was not going to name right now because there was no time for naming, and also because some things were better arrived at slowly, in the right kind of light, when the room was not on fire. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be here." He left. She listened to his footsteps in the corridor, measured, as always, never running, but fast. The fastest she'd heard them. She sat in the antechamber with her stitched arm and the sound of the banquet reassembling itself beyond the walls, and she thought about Branwick. 63 years old, 23 years of proximity and loyalty and earned trust. She thought about what drove a man like that. Not cruelty, she'd already decided. Not personal malice. Something older and more corrosive than malice. The particular rot that came from years of being close to power without holding it. Years of arranging things for other people without credit. Years of competence in service of someone else's name. She thought about what he would do tonight. Where he would go first. What he would burn. And what he would try to save. And which calculation would win. She thought about Alaric finding him and knowing, in the undeniable physical reality of that confrontation, what 23 years of trust looked like when it turned around and showed you what it had been carrying underneath. She stood up. Her arm throbbed. She did not stay in the antechamber. She found Fell in the corridor outside Harwick's townhouse office 12 minutes later, and his face when he saw her told her everything. "Branwick got there first," she said. Fell's expression was the controlled expression of a man delivering news he had not wanted to be the one to deliver. "The filing documents are gone. The challenge supporting evidence, the full dossier Harwick built over the last week, removed from the office. The lock was not forced." He paused. Someone had a key. She absorbed this. The geometry of it. 9 days until the hearing. No supporting documents. An attacker in Crown custody who would be silenced before morning. Carvel's network intact, Branwick now fully burned and therefore fully committed, and Alaric somewhere in this building confronting the specific human shape of all of it. "Where is he?" she said. "The East Corridor. He found Branwick." She moved. She found them in a room off the East Corridor, a small anteroom used for private counsel consultations, lit by 2 lamps, the kind of room designed for conversations that didn't happen in the official record. Alaric was standing, Branwick was sitting. The distance between them was not large, but had the specific quality of distance that cannot be closed. The distance of something permanently altered. She stopped in the doorway. Neither man looked at her. 23 years, Alaric said. His voice was so quiet it was almost below hearing. "My father trusted you. I trusted you. You arranged my marriage. You managed every sensitive operation this duchy has run for the better part of my adult life." Branwick looked at him. His face was something she would not easily forget. Not guilt, not fear, but the face of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long road and was experiencing the landscape of the ending with a clarity that had not been available on the journey. "I did what I calculated was necessary for the duchy's survival. You sold me to Carvel's network. I repositioned our strategic alignment." Branwick's voice was steady. "Your methods, the prosecutions, the council restructure. They created enemies we cannot afford. I built a bridge. You built a weapon pointed at my household. I built a contingency." Something moved in Branwick's face, not remorse, something more complicated. The face of a man who believed his own argument and was finding that belief insufficient against the reality of the room. "Alaric, I have watched you for 8 years make enemies of every powerful house in the Northern Territories in the name of principle. I have watched you be right and be correct and build something genuinely clean, and I have also watched that cleanliness make us isolated and vulnerable in ways that correctness alone cannot repair. What you did, Alaric said, put a blade in reach of my wife tonight." Silence. Branwick looked at the floor. Something had gone out of him. Not the argument, he still had the argument, but the force behind it. That was not sanctioned. The blade was not. I was told it would be a public accusation, a framing, not, "But you built the road it traveled on." Alaric's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You gave them the access, the keys, the documents. You gave Carvel everything he needed to make a move of exactly that kind, and then you are going to tell me you're surprised by the shape of it." Branwick said nothing. Celia stood in the doorway and felt the room and thought about 23 years and what it meant to discover the shape of a thing that had been present in your life so long it had become invisible, the way load-bearing walls were invisible, and then to discover it had been compromised from the inside long before the structure showed strain. She thought about Alaric's face in the antechamber. I intend to be the kind of man who changes that. The intent spoken clearly, without defense, into the specific silence of someone who had been armoring herself against rooms since before she understood why. She thought about what happened to people who discovered that the thing they'd built their architecture of trust on was hollow. She thought, he cannot become cold right now. If he goes cold right now, he loses something he will not recover. The documents, she said. Both men looked at her. Branwick. She kept her voice level. The challenge filing documents. Where are they? A pause. Branwick looked at her and then back at Alaric, and something worked through his face that was neither calculation nor remorse, but something in between, some residual reflex of the loyalty that had been real once, perhaps, before it had been redirected. Lord Carvel's secretary took possession of them an hour ago, Branwick said. They were to be delivered to a location outside the court district by morning. They haven't been delivered yet, she said. It was not a question. No. She looked at Alaric. He was looking at her with that expression, not the undone face, not the composure, but something between them, something that was choosing to be present rather than retreating in either direction. We have tonight, she said. We can recover them. He held her gaze. She watched him take what she was offering, not just the tactical exit, but the other thing underneath it, the reminder that there was still a path forward, still a next step, still something to move toward, instead of only something to process the destruction of. Fell, he said. Fell was in the corridor. I need 4 men in a location by midnight. Already working on the location, Fell said. Give me 20 minutes. Alaric looked at Branwick, the full weight of what was between them. The 23 years, the trust, the architecture now standing open to the weather. This conversation isn't finished. I know, Branwick said, quietly, like a man who had known it was coming for longer than tonight. Alaric walked to the door, stopped beside Celia. He did not touch her. There were too many people in the corridor, and he was still a duke in a political crisis. But he stood close enough that she could feel the specific quality of his presence, the warmth under the cold that she'd been learning for weeks now to read. You didn't stay in the antechamber, he said. No. You have 8 stitches. I'm aware. You shouldn't be... Alaric. She looked up at him. We have tonight. Stop arguing about where I'm standing and let's go get the documents back. A silence. The Winter River eyes. The thing moving in them that she still didn't have the right word for, that she was beginning to think didn't have a word yet, that would need to be named later, in a different kind of room, when there was time. All right, he said. They moved. Fell had the location in 18 minutes. A warehouse in the trade district, 3 streets east of the commercial docks, owned nominally by a textile merchant whose name appeared in none of Carvel's official correspondence and in 3 of Branwick's personal ledgers, which Fell had quietly copied 2 days earlier on the theory that a man who voted visibly in your favor while privately arranging your destruction kept his real record somewhere other than the obvious places. The documents were being held there until a courier could move them out of the capital by river at dawn. They had perhaps 6 hours. Alaric moved through the court's service corridors with Fell at his left and 2 of the duchy's personal guard behind him, and Celia moved with them, and he did not argue about it a second time. He had learned in the space of the last several hours that arguing with her about where she stood was an activity that consumed time and produced nothing. She was going to be where she decided to be. The most efficient response to that was to ensure he was positioned between her and whatever was coming. She noticed. She said nothing about it. He was beginning to understand that this was how she operated. She noticed everything and said the fraction of it that needed saying, and the rest she filed in whatever architecture she kept inside that head, to be used when it became relevant. The night air outside was cold in the direct, unambiguous way of a northern capital in winter. No damp, just the clean edge of temperature that cut through wool and made everything sharper. The streets in the trade district were not empty, but they were quiet, the particular quiet of places that conducted their real business after dark, and had learned to do it without advertising it. Fell held up a fist. They stopped. Two men on the exterior, he said quietly. East door and south corner, both armed, both paying attention. He paused. These aren't Carvel's house guards. They move like hired work. Thresh, Celia thought. The name had a shape now. Not the man himself, whom she still hadn't seen, but the operational signature of him. Professional, economical. The kind of security that didn't come from a noble house's retainer network, but from a different market entirely. How do we want to do this? She said. Alaric looked at the building. She watched him run the calculation. Not just the tactical one, but the one underneath it. The one about what kind of force was appropriate and what the consequences of different approaches looked like in the morning. He was a man who always knew what he was capable of. The question he was currently asking himself was what he was willing to do. She thought he has to hold the line, not because violence isn't available to him, it clearly is, but because the challenge hearing is in 9 days and anything that happens tonight will be examined in that court, and he cannot be the Iron Duke in the old sense if he wants to win in the new arena. Fell, he said, the East Guard. I have him. The south corner is mine. He looked at the two guards behind him. Brace the interior exits. No one leaves until we have the documents. He looked at Celia. You stay at the exterior with line of sight to both doors. And if someone comes out who shouldn't, then you make enough noise that I hear it. She looked at him. That's my entire assignment. Make noise. Your arm has 8 stitches in it. My arm? Make noise, he said, with a finality that was not anger and not dismissal, but the specific tone of a man who had identified one variable he was not willing to negotiate on tonight. That's what I need from you right now. Be my eyes. She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers. The cold air between them and the weight of the building ahead and the 9 stitches she could feel clearly when she stopped concentrating on not feeling them. All right, she said. He moved. Fell moved. The night absorbed them both with the efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. She positioned herself at the angle he'd indicated. Exterior wall, sight line to both entry points, deep enough in the shadow of a loading crane that she was effectively invisible. She watched. Her arm throbbed with the patient insistence of a wound that was not serious but was not inclined to be ignored. She thought about Branwick in that anteroom, the face of a man at the end of a long road. She thought about the logic of him. 23 years, the accumulated weight of proximity without power, the specific erosion that came from being indispensable and uncredited. She understood it. Understanding it did not produce sympathy exactly, but it produced something. The recognition that betrayal was rarely the simple thing the stories made it. It was usually the compound interest on a debt that had been building for longer than anyone wanted to track. She heard a sound from the south corner, brief, physical, resolved quickly. Then quiet. 3 minutes later, the east door opened and Fell came through it and looked at her and nodded. She crossed to the door. The interior of the warehouse was organized in the way of spaces used for operations rather than storage. Cleared floor space, lamplight in specific areas, the detritus of rapid occupancy rather than permanent installation. 2 men were down, neither dead, with the careful efficiency of someone who had incapacitated rather than finished. A 3rd man stood against the interior wall with Alaric's forearm across his collarbone and Alaric's face approximately 8 inches from his. The man had the quality of Thresh's operation, professional, measured, not panicking even in a position that warranted it. That steadiness was itself information. The documents, Alaric said, not loudly. I don't have authorization to... That's not what I asked. A pause. The man's eyes moved to the left, involuntary, the direction people looked when accessing spatial memory, toward a crate against the far wall. Fell was already moving. He pried the crate open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, Harwick's dossier. The full challenge supporting evidence, intact. Alaric looked at the man against the wall. Tell Thresh, he said, that the next time he sends someone into a room where my wife is sitting, I will not be sending a message back. I will be delivering it personally. He stepped back. The man did not move. They left. Harwick was waiting at the townhouse. He took the dossier with the controlled relief of a man who had been running worst-case calculations for 4 hours and was now recalculating. He spread the documents on the table, checked them against his own records, confirmed integrity. Everything's here. File supplementary copies in the morning, Alaric said. 3 separate locations. The challenge hearing is in 9 days, and I want those documents existing in enough places that removing all of them would require a campaign rather than a courier. Yes, Your Grace. Harwick paused. And Branwick? The name landed in the room with the weight it had been carrying since the anteroom. Leave Branwick to me, Alaric said. Harwick nodded and did not ask further. Bell caught Celia's eye across the room. A brief look. The look of someone acknowledging that the conversation that needed to happen between Alaric and Branwick was not a conversation that could be scheduled or managed, only waited for. She waited until they were alone, the study, the 2 of them, the documents secured and the immediate crisis resolved, and the larger one still sitting in the room like furniture you'd stopped seeing because it had been there too long. Sit down, she said. He looked at her. You've been standing for 6 hours. Sit down. He sat. She sat across from him. The lamps were low. Outside, the capital was doing whatever capitals did after midnight, grinding on, impervious, too large for any individual crisis to matter to its overall operation. The hearing, she said. 9 days. Carvel's network knows we have the documents back. They'll try something else before the hearing. Yes. Branwick is the variable. She looked at him directly. He knows everything. He has access to everything he hasn't already given them. If he decides his best option is to complete the burn, he won't. She paused. He voted against the restriction, Alaric said. In front of the full council, on record. If this falls apart and Carvel's faction consolidates, Branwick has no shelter. He burned his bridge to them tonight when he didn't deliver the documents before we recovered them. His jaw set. He's exposed on both sides now, which means his only viable path is the one where the challenge succeeds, and I choose to leave him alive inside whatever comes after. And will you? He looked at her. What? Leave him alive inside whatever comes after. A silence. The honest kind. The kind that had actual content rather than being a pause for form's sake. I don't know yet, he said. She nodded. She had not expected a different answer and would not have trusted one. He might be useful at the hearing. He might be necessary at the hearing. His testimony about the vote structure could close the jurisdictional question Harwick's been worried about. Then you need to have the conversation before 9 days are up. He looked at the table, the lamp, his own hands on the surface in front of him, the controlled stillness she'd been reading for weeks now like a second language. I know. It doesn't have to be tonight. No. A pause. But it has to be while it still has the chance of being honest. She understood what he meant. Conversations with people who had betrayed you had a window. Too soon, and the shock was still moving through you, and everything you said came out shaped by it in ways you couldn't entirely manage. Too late, and the betrayal had calcified into a fixed thing, all its complexity hardened into a version you could live with, which was not the same as a version that was accurate. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She stood. Her arm was at a specific level of insistence now that was no longer something she could partially ignore. She was tired in the way that went deeper than physical. The compound tiredness of a brain that had been processing threat assessments for 16 continuous hours. Celia, she turned. He was still sitting, looking at her. The lamplight on the side of his face and the Winter River eyes with everything they'd been holding all evening still visible in them, unretreated, making no apology for being present. What you did at the banquet table, he said. Don't. I'm not going to thank you. I know you don't want that. He paused. I'm going to say it plainly because I think you've spent enough of your life having things said to you in language that obscures what they actually mean. He held her gaze. You took a blade that was meant for me, not because you were in the way, because you moved toward it. She said nothing. I'm going to spend the next 9 days ensuring that the legal machinery this duchy runs on defeats everyone who made that happen, he said. That's the work. That's what I know how to do, and I'm going to do it. He paused. But I also want you to know that it is not the most important thing that happened tonight. The room was very quiet. Go to sleep, she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how it was steady. We have 9 days. She left before he could see her face. The 9 days were a different kind of war, not the visible kind. No more couriers in the night. No more warehouses. No blades in crowded rooms. The visible kind had resolved itself into a waiting game whose battlefield was paper and precedent and the specific architectural decisions of Crown Commercial Court chambers. But underneath the legal surface, the other war continued with the patience of people who understood that the hearing was not the end of the conflict, only its current expression. Carvel made 3 more approaches before the hearing. All 3 were directed at Celia, a pattern that had become its own kind of intelligence, each attempt telling her more about how they'd mapped her than about what they wanted. First, a written offer, anonymous, outlining financial arrangements for Whitmore House's debt that were contingent on her influence over Alaric's legal strategy. She gave it to Fell without reading it past the first paragraph. Second, a social call from a lord she'd never met whose connection to Carvel's network she identified within 20 minutes of conversation and whose attempt to suggest that the Duke's public declaration at the banquet had damaged his reputation in ways that a more prudent wife might have prevented. She ended that conversation with a precision that apparently left the lord in question briefly, uncertain about which way was up. Third, a message delivered to her maid. Not her. Her maid, suggesting that Alaric's previous marriage attempt, 7 years ago, had ended in circumstances that a new wife might want to understand before committing to his defense. She read the third message twice and then put it in the fire. She told Alaric about all 3. Not to alarm him, he processed the information with the controlled expression she'd stopped misreading as coldness. But because she'd understood early in this process that the value of what she saw depended on him having it, and withholding information from the person you were operating alongside was the beginning of a different kind of problem than the one you were trying to solve. The previous marriage attempt, he said, the evening after the third message. You don't have to tell me. No, but I'm going to. He was at the window, the familiar position, the capital outside, indifferent as always. 7 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Elara Sefton. She was suitable in every political sense. The arrangement was 3 months from completion when she formed a private arrangement with Lord Carvel's eldest son. He paused. She preferred the match. The engagement was dissolved. Carvel's faction has been using that story to suggest I have a personal grievance motivating my legal actions against his network. She looked at him. Is there a grievance? There is a memory that I processed and set aside because it was not useful, and there is a legal case that has been built on evidence over 8 years, and those 2 things are not connected. He turned from the window. I wanted you to have the accurate version. Thank you, she said. A pause. He looked at her with the particular quality that had been consistent since the first day, and that she'd been learning to read in increasing resolution, the quality of genuine attention, presence without agenda, the specific form of respect that treated her as someone worth being accurate with. You asked me once, he said, how I ended up with the reputation I have. Useful fiction, she said. I remember. The fiction was useful because the reality was, he paused, choosing, the reality was that I had made a great deal of enemies doing work that needed doing, and the fear was the only deterrent I had that matched the scale of the opposition. The Iron Duke existed because Alaric Ravenshade, on his own, was a man with 8 years of correct decisions and a duchy full of people who depended on those decisions holding, and no guarantee they would. He looked at her. The fiction made people hesitate. Hesitation bought time. Time was what the legal work required. She thought about this. And now the fiction has become a liability. Now they've decided the fiction proves I'm capable of anything, including framing Carvel's network on false evidence. Which is why the hearing matters. Which is why the hearing has to be clean. Something moved in his face. I cannot win this the way I would have won it 3 years ago. The methods are different now. Because you're different. He held her gaze. Because I have something different to protect. The words sat in the air between them. She let them sit. The confrontation with Branwick happened on the 7th day. She was not in the room. She had decided on her own, without being asked, that it was not her room to be in, that there were things Alaric needed to say and hear in the specific privacy of a relationship that had preceded her by 2 decades, and her presence would change the temperature of it in ways that wouldn't serve him. She sat in the library with Hartwell's 4th edition and listened to the muffled quality of 2 voices through a wall and did not try to parse the words. Just the sound. The rhythm of it. which was mostly Alaric's voice, measured and continuous in a way that meant he was saying what he had prepared to say, and then Branwick's voice, briefer, with the cadence of a man answering rather than defending, which was different. An hour later, Alaric came into the library. She looked up. "He'll testify," he said, voluntarily. Full account of the vote arrangement, the document transfer, his contact within Carvel's network. He paused. In exchange for a private settlement rather than public prosecution. "And you agreed?" "I agreed." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the composure fully back in place, and she understood that the composure meant something different than it had 2 months ago. It wasn't a wall anymore, or not only a wall, but a choice. The deliberate decision to hold yourself together, not because you couldn't come undone, but because coming undone wasn't the shape you wanted to take. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "but I will be." She nodded. He came in and sat down, and she passed him Hartwell's 4th edition without comment, and they spent the evening preparing for the hearing. The Crown Commercial Court on the morning of the 9th day was everything the winter banquet had not been. Not performance, not spectacle, but the stripped-down machinery of institutional decision, operating according to rules that had been built over centuries precisely because the people who made them understood that without those rules, power would settle everything, and power settling everything was the system they were trying to replace. Harwick argued the jurisdictional question. He was precise, prepared, and almost aggressively thorough. 9 copies of the supporting documents filed in 9 locations, every amendment cross-referenced, Branwick's testimony entered into the record the day before, with a specificity that made the vote arrangement visible in its full operational detail. Celia sat in the gallery beside Lady Vane and watched the chamber floor. Carvel was present. He had to be. As the named party in the challenge, his attendance was required. He sat at the respondents' table with 2 counselors and the quality of a man who had surveyed the board and was recalculating, not panicking. Carvel, she had concluded, was not a man who panicked. He was a man who adapted, who had been adapting for 11 years, who would be adapting for whatever came after this. The question was what came after this. The panel of 3 commercial court judges conferred twice during the morning's arguments. The second conference was longer, 7 minutes by the clock on the chamber wall, and when they returned, their expressions had the specific quality of people who had arrived at a conclusion they'd actually thought about, rather than one they'd prepared in advance. The presiding judge spoke for 8 minutes. Celia tracked the legal language with the Hartwell grammar she'd built over the past weeks, and understood the shape of it before the final determination was delivered. The challenge was upheld. The vote to restrict Northern Duchy trade licensing was ruled procedurally invalid under the Commercial Court's jurisdictional standards. The licensing authority reverted to its prior state pending a full parliamentary review, which would take no less than 18 months and would be conducted under the revised council composition, meaning, practically, that Carvel's faction had lost its mechanism. Not permanently, not completely, but the ground had shifted, and they all knew it. Alaric received the determination with the composure she had stopped misreading. He thanked Harwick. He spoke briefly with Lord Vane, who had come to the chamber floor after the ruling, with the air of a man who had correctly bet on an outcome and was gracious about being right. He shook hands in the way of someone who understood that the relationship maintenance was as much the work as the legal argument. She watched him from the gallery, the way he moved through the room, the way people responded to him, not the old response, not the fear-adjacent deference of the Iron Duke mythos, but something different, something that had to do with watching a man operate with complete integrity under sustained pressure and finding, at the end of it, that he was still standing exactly where he said he'd be. She thought, this is what changes, not the power. The power was always there. What changes is what it's for. Lady Vane touched her arm lightly. Well done, Lady Ravenshade. Harwick did the legal work. Harwick filed the paperwork. Lady Vane looked at the chamber floor. You kept the man on his feet long enough to let Harwick do it. She watched Alaric cross the chamber floor. He looked up and found her in the gallery. Direct, immediate, the way he found things he was looking for, and held her gaze for a moment that had no legal significance and no political content whatsoever. She looked back. They left the court in the early afternoon and returned to the townhouse separately, navigating the small armies of well-wishers and the distinctly less festive presences of Carvel's allies, with the controlled efficiency of people who had been managing rooms for weeks and were getting reasonably good at it. She was in the study when he arrived. She had been expecting him. She did not know exactly what she had been expecting, only that something had been building toward this room for 9 days, and possibly longer than 9 days. And the hearing being done meant the last structure they'd been operating under had dissolved, and whatever was underneath it was now the actual ground. He closed the door. She turned to look at him. He crossed the room, and she did not move away from him, which was its own answer to a question neither of them had quite asked directly yet. And he stopped in front of her and looked at her with the Winter River eyes completely unguarded in a way she had only seen once before. In an antechamber with a physician and 8 stitches and the sound of 200 people reassembling themselves after a moment of real violence. "The townhouse is secured," he said. "The challenge stands. Carvel's network is disrupted. Branwick is managed." His voice was quiet and entirely even. "The work is done." "For now," she said. "For now." He looked at her. "I want to say something." "You can say it." He stopped. Started again. "I have spent 20 years being exactly what this duchy required me to be. I have been strategic and patient and entirely willing to operate in the gap between what the law could do and what the situation required. I have been, when necessary, the thing people were afraid of." He paused. I was not planning to be anything else. The marriage was practical. I was going to be practical." She waited. "You made that impossible," he said. "Not through any campaign or intention, just by being exactly the person you are, in every room I put you in, with no performance and no concession and no readjustment for whatever I was supposed to need you to be." Something moved in his face. The deep water movement, all the way to the surface, staying there. "I don't know what to do with you. I mean that is the most honest thing I have said in years." She looked at him. The study. The afternoon light. The man in front of her who had just said the most honest thing he'd said in years with the same quality he brought to everything. No excess, no performance, just the thing itself, set down in the space between them and left there. "I know what to do with you," she said. He looked at her. "We go back to Ravenshade," she said. "You talk to the garrison commander you've been putting off talking to. I finish organizing the library. We deal with the next crisis when it arrives. And there will be a next crisis, because that is the nature of what you do." She held his gaze. "And somewhere inside all of that, we figure out the rest." A pause. "The rest," he said. "You know what the rest is?" "I want to hear you say it." She looked at him for a long moment. The distance between them was small. It had been getting smaller for 2 months, and neither of them had been pretending it hadn't. "Come home," she said, "and we'll get there." He put his hand against her face, large and warm and dry, the same calibration as the first night in the chapel, and yet entirely different, because that night it had been a man holding a political obligation with appropriate care. And this was a man holding something he had not expected and had not protected himself against, and had no current intention of protecting himself against. "All right," he said. They left for Ravenshade the next morning. She thought it was over. She thought the crisis had its shape now. The legal victory, the disrupted network, Branwick's managed settlement. The ground shifted, if not yet permanently held. She thought the worst of it was behind them, and what remained was the slower work, the sustainable work, the kind of work that built something instead of only defending it. She was wrong. The letter arrived on the morning of their 3rd day back at the manor. It was brought to her directly by a courier who had ridden through the night and whose horse was blown in a way that meant he had not stopped once in the mountain pass. She took it in the East Gardens, where she had been watching the overgrown hedges and thinking about what she wanted to do with the space. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she went inside and found Alaric in the study where he always was in the morning, with the garrison correspondence and the trade reports and the accumulated weight of 300,000 people's practical realities, and she put the letter on the desk in front of him without a word. He read it. His face did not change. Something in the room changed. "When?" he said. 3 days ago." She kept her voice level. "The Crown has moved. The Parliamentary Council is calling for a formal investigation into the commercial court ruling. They're claiming procedural irregularity in Harwick's filing." She paused. "The investigating committee will be chaired by Lord Edminster." Edminster. The man who controlled household guard assignments. The man Branwick had been talking to at the banquet, 20 minutes before the blade. That's not the worst part, she said. He looked up. The committee has the authority to suspend the commercial court's determination pending investigation, she said. Meaning the trade restriction goes back into effect. Meaning Carvel's network gets its mechanism back. She held his gaze. And the investigation has no mandated timeline. It can run indefinitely. A silence. They don't need to win in court, Alaric said. His voice was quiet in that particular way. They just need to stall long enough to bankrupt the duchy's trade revenue. Yes. She looked at him. This was always the second move. The hearing was the distraction. He stood. Something had shifted in the room completely. The atmosphere, the air, the quality of the silence around them. She had seen the Iron Duke in the court chamber, composed and surgical and working entirely within the rules. She had seen him at the banquet, undone and furious and completely human. She had seen him at the window, carrying the cost of 23 years of betrayal with the dignity of a man who had decided what shape he was going to take. What she saw now was different from all of those. What she saw now was the man who had reached the end of what patience and legality and strategic restraint could accomplish, and was standing at the edge of a decision about what came next, and the decision was not a legal one. Alaric, she said. He looked at her. There's a third option, she said, between the legal machine that just got outmaneuvered and the other thing you're thinking about right now. She kept her eyes on his. I need you to hear me before you decide. He looked at her for a long moment. You have 30 seconds, he said. She began to talk. She had 30 seconds. She used them. Edminster's appointment to chair the committee requires parliamentary confirmation, she said. That confirmation hasn't happened yet. It's scheduled for 3 days from now. If you can get 2 confirmation votes to abstain, the appointment fails and the committee cannot be legally constituted. Without the committee, there is no suspension mechanism. The commercial court determination stands. He was watching her with the full quality of his attention, not the 30-second clock she'd given him. He had already stopped counting. Vane, she said, and Hartwick of the eastern seat. Both voted against the trade restriction. Both have reasons to want Edminster specifically kept off an investigative committee. Edminster has been quietly building a case against Hartwick's